Hey, folks, I'm here with Geoff Young, the congressional candidate and local political figure, outspoken anti-imperialist in Kentucky. Welcome, Geoff.
Hi, Caleb.
How are you?
Doing fine. How about you?
I'm good. So the idea was that now that you've read my new book, Letter to Bob Avakian, we would just have a short chat about it. Does that sound good?
That would be great.
Great. So what stood out to you from the book?
Well, a few things, quite a few things. While I was reading it, I copied and pasted some passages that were particularly meaningful to me. But just in general, I thought, the first part of the book was a very complimentary set of messages to Bob Avakian about all of the things he has accomplished in terms of the anti-war movement, um, fighting against police brutality, and several issues over a period of decades. I had heard his name before I read this book last week, but I knew very little about him. So this was very educational for me, and I thought the first part where you were listing all of what he's accomplished over such a long period, his persistence and charisma, and all of that was a really good way to start the book,
Thank you.
as opposed to starting with your criticisms or critiques.
Sure.
Um,
Now, where had you heard Bob Avakian's name before?
well, I was living in Cambridge, Massachusetts, from Cambridge and Boston, just across the river, Charles River, from 1974 to about 78
Hmm.
or into 79. Um, the first 3 years were at MIT in Cambridge, and I would, run into people from all kinds of political groups, including the LaRoucheites and um, let's see, there were a lot of people teaching transcendental meditation, and
Hmm.
not political, but
Sure.
and so I don't know, I heard his name mentioned, and
Yeah,
occasionally.
I've heard people call it the People's Republic of Cambridge when referring to
Okay,
those years.
yeah,
I mean,
yeah,
it was
yeah,
quite a left-wing spot, right? I mean, that's where Harvard is, if I believe correctly.
that's right.
Hmm.
Yeah, and MIT is not too far away.
Yeah. So, I guess, when you read what I had written that was complimentary toward him, what was your reaction to it?
Well, I was impressed by his accomplishments and the accomplishments of the Revolutionary Communist Party. I knew so little that I didn't know that he was associated with that particular group.
Hmm.
I don't know how many socialist and communist parties and groups there are in this country, but I'm guessing, a dozen or 2 dozen, maybe more. A lot of them very small. So yeah, I didn't associate Bob Avakian with that particular group,
Yeah.
and it was really interesting. All the
Yeah, no,
things
I
they
remember when
did.
I was a teenager, I first heard that there was a communist party in the United States, and I was shocked. And I found it on the internet, and I was like, wow, there's people in the United States who believe in communism. And then I
Uh-huh.
looked and I found out there's actually like, scores of different communist parties that all have
Okay.
rivalries with each other. The alphabet soup people talk about, the RCP
Yeah.
and the SWP and the CP and the
Yeah.
WWP and the ISO and the QWH and the XYZ.
Uh-huh.
it can be a little bit overwhelming, you know, and I
Well,
think that
my great uncle and great aunt, um, Vernon and Florence Fox, were members of the old Communist Party, probably, in the 30s, 40s. Um, I wasn't born until 1956, and they would occasionally talk with me when I was quite young and try to get me interested in the Communist Party. And I didn't really respond at that time, but starting in around 1973, I started reading Noam Chomsky, two books. I guess his first two books that were about politics rather than linguistics, and it was about, against the U.S. war of aggression in Vietnam.
Now,
so that's when I became radicalized, around 75, 76.
Now, these relatives of yours, you said your great aunt and your great uncle, what were they like? What were they involved in? Where did they live? What was their story?
I'm a little, I forget some of the details, but I think they lived in New Jersey.
Okay.
And they were involved in labor organizing and, helping the Communist Party expand. Totally against McCarthyism. That's one thing that they spent a lot of time working on.
Wow. Wow. So then I guess moving on, when I got to my criticism of Bob Avakian, I guess what stood out to you about that?
That it was based in Marxist theory. And that, I think, was probably your main point, that he and the RCP have kind of gone down a path of idealism as contrasted with materialism and economics. They seem to focus nowadays, at least what I gathered from your book, on things like anti-racism, the abortion issue, social issues, and not so much on restructuring the entire economy and dethroning the capitalist class, the billionaires, the 1%, the military-industrial complex, the huge for-profit corporations, dethroning them and creating an economy that works for everyone, especially workers and the poor.
Yeah, they do kind of just ignore economics, and that was a really big point that I made. I also talked about how they refer to Russia and China as imperialists, and yeah. I don't agree with that. What did you think of that section?
I liked it. I don't agree with that either. I think Russia was an imperialist country until 1917. And after that, well, they had to fight a long war to actually gain control or sovereignty over Russia. And then they wanted and needed a buffer zone, especially against rival powers, capitalist powers, mainly Germany, to their west. So I don't consider that imperialism. China has pretty much been, I mean, you could say it was an empire for thousands of years. That would be accurate. They had an emperor, but it was not an expansionist empire in the sense that imperialist countries generally are expanded. They're always trying to conquer new land, new resources, new markets, because of this uh, desire for profits and super profits that is built into capitalism, especially corporate capitalism.
Hmm. Yeah. Now, in the book, one of the points of criticism I raised was that while they neglect to talk about economics, that then leads them to kind of that their criticism of U.S. society is more about authoritarianism, uh,
Mm-hmm.
and that seems to be more what it's about, and they kind of miss the essence of the Marxist critique of economics. Um,
Yeah.
you did you see that point?
Yes,
Did
I did.
Mhm.
I can relate to it in the set in from my own experience in the early and mid 1980s. I moved to from Massachusetts to Kentucky, Lexington, Kentucky, in 1982, and pretty soon joined a group of people who were trying to stop the United States from funding the Contras in Central America, um, focused on Nicaragua and El Salvador. I think most of them were DSA members also. Uh, DSA has changed over the decades. Uh,
Yeah, well,
but
the DSA was kind of new back then, right? Michael
mm,
Harrington and In These
mm,
Times, and it was a lot of people
yeah,
that had been Maoist communists. As China changed, they kind of went to the DSA. Is that correct?
I'm not sure, but the name Michael Harrington is familiar in these. I subscribed to it for several years in the 80s. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, great newspaper.
Yeah, and that the DSA was kind of a new formation in those years, right? It was like
Okay, yeah, probably.
people that had been in Maoist communist groups or just been generally part of the new left, had protested the Vietnam War or whatever, were moving into DSA, I think, in this time you're describing.
I think you're right.
Yeah. And then another aspect of this that I thought was, this period you're describing about the Contras was that Russell Means, who had been the leader of the American Indian movement, had
Yes.
been, associated with the Black Panthers. He was on the other side of that. He was going around rallying support for the Contras. And that was kind of the
Oh,
beginning.
I didn't know that at all.
Yeah, yeah, that was kind of the beginning of the co-optation of kind of leftist politics in the name of supporting indigenous people. He was saying the Contras were bad, and he was fundraising, or not the Contras, but the Sandinistas were bad, and fundraising for the Contras, and
Okay.
that was kind of the beginning of some of the co-optation of identity politics and such. But yeah, you were saying it reminded you of those years. What was it that it reminded you of?
Well, they were our group was trying to stop U.S. aid to terrorists in Central America, Nicaragua,
Yeah.
and so uh, a couple of us, myself and one other member of that DSA group, got visited by the FBI. Uh, Knocked on my door one day, and they said, "Oh, well, we're from the FBI." They showed me their badges. I wasn't ready to copy their badge numbers down or write down their names. And they said they were talking pretty fast. They said, "Oh, somebody across the street there is applying for a federal job, and we just wanted to do a check on them." On her, and I just said, "Well, I don't want to talk with you about anything." So they left. They immediately left.
Wild.
I don't think they were really uh, considering a neighbor for a job. I think that was a lie.
Yeah. They wanted to see if they could get you to become an informant or to open dialogue with you.
Yeah, yeah, probably to see what I knew about the anti imperialist group.
Yeah, well, one of the books that I quote in my book, I quote this book, which came out a few years ago, which is very good. It's an academic book called "Heavy Radicals: The FBI's Secret War on America's Maoists." And it talks about the extent to which the Revolutionary Communist Party was infiltrated by the FBI and by other organizations during this period. And it's very interesting. It's very, very interesting. And one of the things I talk about, which you'll probably recall, is that the group was heavily infiltrated not just by the FBI, but by a right-wing organization called Western Goals. You remember me talking about that?
Yes.
And what struck you about that particular section?
Well, how subtle and devious they were. I mean, you could probably summarize it quicker than I could, having written the book. So, but you know, their tactics were really sneaky.
Yeah, and I mean, it looks to me that the events of 1979, where you have Deng Xiaoping coming to the United States to establish diplomatic relations, and then the Revolutionary Communist Party, Bob Avakian maintaining that Deng Xiaoping has sold out communism, that he's a revisionist. And you have two of their members getting into the White House and disrupting the proceedings. And then you have a very extreme, violent demonstration outside the White House by members of the Revolutionary Communist Party. And then 2 days prior to that, when the Chinese embassy opened in Washington, D.C., you had Revolutionary Communist Party members trashing the embassy and just, smashing it and all of that. And that it appears, based on what the research that I've done, that they were doing this under the direction of the FBI. That they thought they were doing it because they thought they thought China had abandoned communism. But it appears there were figures in this Western Goals organization that didn't want Jimmy Carter to establish diplomatic relations with China, and were kind of manipulating the RCP to do this. And that's what it looks like to me. And that's one of the big revelations in the book. Did you find that section to be of interest? Did it stand out?
Oh yeah. Well, I was really disappointed that the RCP had become that hostile, even violent, against the idea of recognizing Communist China, People's Republic of China, as the main representative, the only representative of the Chinese people. Yeah, I'm trying to recall what I might have thought at the time. I think I thought that I'm basically a peacenik.
Sure.
That's my main issue. And I thought that, along with all the horrible things Nixon did, bombing Southeast Asia and all that, recognizing China, I felt at the time, and still do, that was a big step forward. At least getting us into the real world. Before we had recognized only Taiwan, this little island. And so recognizing the actual country was, I thought, great. Maybe we can all benefit from that.
Yeah, well, what's interesting is I understand that is why in China, Henry Kissinger is still well loved.
That's right. Yeah.
Because he oversaw that. Even though, we in the United States, peace guys like you and me, we see Henry Kissinger as a murderer for Vietnam and for Chile. But because he arranged for, the USA and China to kind of start to move toward having relations, the Chinese are going to love Henry Kissinger for that reason.
Right. So at age 100, he goes and visits again, and he's received with vastly more respect than any other American official or politician in China, for the past several years.
Yeah.
I'm getting a message here. Recording error. We're out of someone's running out of storage space on a device.
Huh. That's interesting. Okay, I'm not getting any similar message.
Okay, well, I mean, it might not matter
okay.
if I can't record it. I'm not planning. I wasn't planning to record it, so it doesn't matter. If you get the message, then you can do something about it.
Well, very good. But yeah, the other thing that that happened during that same period, and was the Iran hostage crisis,
Mm-hmm.
where the U.S. embassy was seized. And I understand that was a very hard time to be a progressive or a leftist in the United States. I mean, I was alive during 9/11, and I remember the big pro-military mobilizations after 9/11. And people tell me, I wasn't alive at the time, that it was kind of like that everyone everywhere was supporting the hostages. There were these yellow ribbons to support the hostages.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you recall that period?
Oh, yes, I remember it. Yeah, complete hostility against the Ayatollah,
Hmm.
who had kidnapped these innocent American embassy employees. Um, uh, and I thought in general, Jimmy Carter handled it pretty well by using diplomacy and not military force until late in his term, when he finally gave uh, permission to Oliver North to do a raid, which failed. I suspected at the time that maybe it failed on purpose.
Hmm.
Uh, Oliver North was, extreme neocon, right winger. Um, so, yeah, I don't know if it was any harder or easier than any other time in my
Well, we now know.
experience as an anti-war activist.
I
But
mean, we now know that Ronald Reagan was in touch with
yeah,
Khomeini and asked
yeah,
Khomeini not to release the hostages
yeah,
until Jimmy Carter had left office.
yeah. George Herbert Walker Bush was the intermediary and made that deal. Um,
Talk about
to
election
avoid,
meddling.
yeah,
You know,
yeah, the most extreme election meddling. They were running up to the 1980 presidential election. Jimmy Carter was running to be reelected and was opposed by Ronald Reagan and Bush the first as vice president. And I believe that they um, colluded with the Iranian government to keep the hostages until after the election.
yeah. Well, when I was in Iran, I had the opportunity, and I hope that someday I can get the video to do a sit down interview with one of the hostage takers, who was
Oh.
a woman who had been part of the, I think it was called the Students Taking Imam's Line, the Islamic group that had taken the hostages. And what
Mm-hmm.
she told me was that the reason that they didn't release the hostages until Jimmy Carter had left office, and the reason they made that deal, was because they didn't want Iran to be perceived as a Soviet aligned country. That if they had released the hostages prior to that, that would have communicated to the world that Iran, after the revolution, was now a Soviet aligned country, and that they wanted Iran to be neither East nor West. And so it was part of communicating to the world that Iran was not Soviet aligned, which is what many people believe, because the Ayatollah had been so anti-American. They saw Iran
Mm-hmm.
as being Soviet aligned, which I thought was an interesting interpretation. One of the slogans of the Islamic Revolution that's painted everywhere is neither East nor West.
Mm-hmm.
And they have that painted. And they also told me, I went to see Khomeini's house when I was in Iran, and they told me that there was a moment that apparently was very famous when a Soviet diplomat had come to Khomeini's house and spoken disrespectfully to Khomeini, and he just got up and walked out of the room, and it was very
Mm.
famous, and they showed it all over Iranian television. But it was also a very strange moment because Iran, I mean, the revolution had been an anti-imperialist revolution, but it
Mm-hmm.
was not a Marxist revolution. And so Iran was in this weird place, and then they were invaded by Iraq, and Iraq was a Ba'athist Arab socialist government that had been armed and was closely aligned with the Soviet Union. So Iran was in this very, very strange place politically. But also,
Mm-hmm.
the Soviet Union was de-escalating. I mean, it was the Gorbachev years were coming in. So, the Soviet Union was gradually kind of winding down its anti-imperialism also. So it was a very confusing
Mm-hmm.
time in Iranian history. A very,
Mm.
very strange moment. And we understand the American government and the Israeli government were on both sides of the Iraq-Iran war. They were giving
Right.
weapons and guns to both sides at different
Right.
times, which is
Right.
wild. Yeah.
Well, in order to maximize the bloodshed
Yeah. And, but I
and
guess,
weaken both countries.
yes, right. I mean, you had two countries that had broken free to some degree or other, and one in the name of Ba'athist Arab socialism, and the other in the name of Islamic Shia revolutionary anti-imperialism.
Hmm.
And the USA played them against each other.
Hmm.
And the USA tried to make Saddam Hussein believe that the Shia Muslims of Iraq were going to revolt against him. The USA also, tried to, manipulate Iran and promote forces in Iran that wanted to spread the Islamic revolution all over the world and not just confine it to Iran. And there was an uprising in Saudi Arabia among Shia Muslims around the same time, and there was a lot of just intelligence manipulation. I mean, this was
Hmm.
the whole thing. If you read The Grand Chessboard by Brzezinski, he said, keep the
Hmm.
barbarians killing each other, right? And the way the USA could dominate Eurasia was to manipulate the different ethnicities and peoples and political movements and religions against each other. And it seems like, the Carter years in particular was when they were really doing this. Carter was the national security advisor to Brzezinski, or to Brzezinski was the national security advisor to Carter, and that
Hmm.
they were effectively playing communists and revolutionaries around the world against each other. And it was the same time you had the Kampuchea War, where China invaded Vietnam.
Hmm.
That happened around the same time, and it was a strategy of manipulation.
Hmm.
And I guess the point that I make in my book is that applied to activists in the United States. And
Hmm.
one point that I point out, and many people that were around and were politically active during those years will recall that they feel like the way the RCP and the Bob Avakian followers conducted themselves during those years, it was almost like they were part of the staging of these anti-Iran rallies. They would show up at the
Hmm.
anti-Iran rallies and light the American flag on fire and use
Hmm.
profanity and such, and the crowds would just beat the hell out of them. These mobs of right-wing people would just beat them up, and it was almost like they were there to be part of the show. They were the heels in wrestling terminology. You think there's any truth in that?
It seems reasonable to assume that, going to an anti-Iran rally and burning the American flag, they're trying to portray themselves as pro-Iranian, right? Or pro-extremist Iranian, pro-Ayatollah. That's probably how the crowd of Americans perceive them. And so, but they weren't. I mean, you're saying they were actually uh, working for the U.S. deep state.
I mean, it looks like that to me, based on the research. It looks like Western goals, and that the wing of the American deep state that was aligned with Oliver North and Ronald Reagan, that wanted to depose Jimmy Carter, it looks like it had thoroughly infiltrated the RCP and was using them for those
Mhm.
purposes. But then after,
What did they say about why they burned the American flag and went to these anti-Iranian rallies? I understand what they were doing with Deng Xiaoping,
mm-hmm. Well,
but
their feeling was that they were anti-imperialist, that America was the greatest imperialist empire. They would chant "Red, white, and blue. We spit on you. You stand for plunder. You will go under." And they eventually took it all the way to the Supreme Court. 1984, Johnson versus Texas. Gregory Johnson, or Joey Johnson was his nickname. He went by Joey. He was a member of the Revolutionary Communist Party, and he burned the American flag at the Republican convention in Texas that year. And they
okay,
sentenced him to
okay.
2 years.
So it wasn't just Iran; it was
Yeah.
just wherever they could get some video cameras.
Yeah,
To,
it was their kind of publicity thing,
I
and Gregory
see. Okay.
Johnson ended up taking it to the Supreme Court, and it's the RCP that's responsible for getting flag burning legalized, which I think is a great victory for free speech. I mean, I wave the American flag at my events. I consider myself to be patriotic, and my socialism to
Yeah.
be patriotic. But I believe if somebody wants to burn the American flag, they should have the right to do so. And
Yeah.
that, the first person to burn the American flag in protest, my understanding, was Marcus Garvey, who was a black nationalist, and he said that we're not Americans, we're Africans, and it was a statement of black liberation. And I absolutely would defend the right of any black nationalist or black revolutionary to burn the American flag to make a point about how black people have been treated. I mean, it's one thing to advocate free speech; it's another thing to have your own perception and tactics. And And then the other thing that I've read widely is back when Marcus Garvey burned the American flag, no one cared. He wasn't arrested for flag desecration because many of the white supremacist forces and others felt that, yes, black people are not Americans. They shouldn't have equal rights and such. So there was not outrage about Marcus Garvey burning the American flag, which is
about when did that happen?
In the 1920s, I believe. Marcus Garvey was burning the American flag.
That's interesting.
Yeah, and there was no outrage about it. It was just something he did at every one of his black nationalist rallies, and no one seemed to care. It was when in the 60s you had 60s radicals doing it to make a statement. Then suddenly there was outrage about it, and the RCP, I mean, to their credit, they took it to the Supreme Court. You know, there was this Gregory Johnson guy. He was in jail, and the Supreme Court freed him. There was a woman in Cleveland. Her name was Cheryl Lesson. She was also a follower of Bob Avakian. And after the Supreme Court had already legalized burning the American flag, she burned a flag in protest of the Gulf War. And they arrested her for that, saying she'd incited a riot by burning the American flag. I guess the police had told her not to before she did it or something. And she ended up being in prison for almost a year in Ohio, even though the Supreme Court had legalized it. So, you know, you can't look at that organization, as much as I'm critical of their view of imperialism and such. You can't look at that group and say, these are not a group of people that are willing to make great sacrifices for what they believe.
That's right.
And Bob Avakian, I mean, he had to flee the country. I mean, he was facing a very serious prison sentence. They dropped the charges against him for the Deng Xiaoping protest. Then they reinstated them, and then he fled the country. And he spent the next several decades in Paris. What did you think of that section of the book?
I thought it was interesting. You claimed that he was being contacted by various French leftists. I guess that didn't grab me as much of the other parts of the book.
Well, what's interesting
is he still alive today?
He is. He's 82
Have you ever
years.
talked with him, directly or by phone?
He is not available for interviews, and he, everything around him is very secretive. His location is kept secret. Very rarely. The last time he had a public appearance, it was at Riverside Church with Cornell West 5 or 6 years ago. But his whereabouts are hidden. He does not do interviews. He's not available for interviews. He's 82 years old. He did return to the United States in 2003. What I thought was interesting is after I published the piece arguing that to some degree or other he had probably reached some kind of understanding with the French government and with French intelligence. That's what I argued. A number of Russians came to me and they said, Caleb, you don't know the half of it. Right after the war in Ukraine escalated, a lot of the Russian communist dissidents, the main communist party in Russia supports Putin and supports the intervention. But there are a number of smaller communist parties that are like Trotskyite kind of parties. Almost all of those people immediately defected to Paris, which is very interesting, which kind of fits the thesis of my book, that the French intelligence apparatus has developed kind of a mechanism for cultivating leftists around the world to do their work. That's kind of what I argued, and it seems like I was definitely right about that. Did you see the part about Ira Einhorn? Do you remember that part?
No.
Oh, I talked about the founder of Earth Day was this guy named Ira Einhorn. And, he had been the leader of the Philadelphia Earth Day celebration. He had many times in the press been referred to as the founder of Earth Day. And he was arrested for murdering his girlfriend. And the police searched his apartment and found her mummified body in his apartment. And then he apparently got asylum in France for many years. And he was discovered living in France in 1997. And the French government went out of their way to fight his extradition. The state of Pennsylvania was forced to pass a special law to allow him to finally be extradited in the year of 2001. But apparently he was in hiding in France for many, many years. And it's a very strange case the more you look into the case of Ira Einhorn. He was this environmental activist, well-known leftist in Philadelphia, charged with murder. When he came back to the United States and stood trial, his trial almost got a media blackout. There was very little coverage of it. But at his trial, he read into the record all kinds of testimony about CIA mind control programs that he said he was aware of. And he claimed that he did not murder his girlfriend, that it was the CIA who murdered his girlfriend, and that he had been he had been cooperating with the CIA in some kind of mind control operations, and that's why his girlfriend had been killed. And I mean, it's a very strange case, and honestly, I don't know what to believe. Many people look at the facts and they say, well, this guy murdered his girlfriend, but the fact that he then disappeared from the country and showed up and lived in France for decades, and that the Brofman family of Canada, very wealthy family, paid his bail and kind of arranged for him to be able to flee the country, is very suspicious and very strange. And then the fact that the French government worked so hard. I mean, they delayed his extradition by 4 years, and they worked very, very hard. And they, you know, and they're basically forcing the state of Pennsylvania to pass a special law so he can be extradited. That whole case is very, very, very strange, you know. And that, you know, this intelligence world is a very murky one, right? I mean, we've been learning now about how the FBI meddled in the elections to make sure that Biden won by suppressing the Hunter Biden laptop story. You know, we know about how J. Edgar Hoover was, you know, trying to fight against the anti-war movement. At the same time, you know, you had people like Ramsey Clark who were supporters of the anti-war movement. I used to work with Ramsey Clark, and he was the U.S. Attorney General under Lyndon Johnson, and he supported the anti-war movement and was doing everything he could as Attorney General to support the anti-war protests. And that it was very clear you have wings of the government, wings of the state fighting against each other, right? You know, like the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing, or it does know, and it's trying to actively stop it. And I feel like as U.S. society is entering a crisis, we're going to see a lot more of these kind of things where it's sections of the American state fighting against each other with different agendas. What do you think of that?
That makes sense to me. Yeah, it's not a monolith. Sometimes it seems as if the neocons have taken over everything, but that's not quite true. There are still some members, even currently, who think, well, this Ukraine war has gone on long enough. It's time to cut our losses. We don't want a nuclear war over this, or over Estonia or Poland. So yeah, there are different factions within the ruling elite.
Absolutely. Well, is there anything you'd like to add on the book before we conclude?
Let me just look at some of the passages that I found particularly impressive or illuminating. Let's see, here's one from page 123. You wrote, fighting for an anti-imperialist position today is just as vitally important as it was in 1914. Humanity is on the brink of a new world war. I agree with that. And if such a war breaks out, Russia and China must win and the Western imperialist powers must lose. Any other outcome would be completely devastating for the future of the human race. Clarity on this point must be established. And so reading that without having the book in front of me, it seems that you must have been talking about Bob Avakian's view that Russia and China are not socialist states anymore, that they've become imperialist states like the Western countries. But that passage was very clear, and I found it helpful.
Sure. Well, I'm almost quoting the words of my good friend Jyoti Brar, who's the leader of the Communist Party of Great Britain, Marxist-Leninist. And she started a group called the World Anti-Imperialist Platform that has gatherings around the world. And it's communist parties around the world that take that position, that if a new world war does break out, it's very clear that there's one side, Russia and China, that must win. And there's just no question about that, and that we should do everything we can to prevent the breaking out of such a war if possible.
Right.
But we can't take a plague on both your houses position. And in the international communist movement, unfortunately, there have been many many very big communist parties that have taken a neutral position on Ukraine, or in some cases sided with NATO. However, every communist government that's in power supports Russia in Ukraine. Vietnam, China, Nicaragua, Venezuela, Belarus, Laos, North Korea, you name it. Any government that's led by communists that actually, that is actually in power takes the Russian position. But unfortunately, there's been a lot of confusion among communists, and I blame that. On the work of the intelligence agencies and George Soros and the kind of, the soft power, the funding of grants, and that a lot of these old communists are now college professors, especially in Europe. And they in order to get grants for their research, they have to explore things from a different way and such. And, I think that, Euro communism, right? 1978, the French Communist Party, the Italian Communist Party, and the Spanish Communist Party signed a document denouncing the Soviet Union. And, Brzezinski thought that was a great step forward. And he called that, he started calling them Euro communists and saying, well, the Euro communists aren't so bad. It's the hardline communists that are the bad ones. And I think that was the work of American intelligence. I think they did a lot to cultivate those folks. And that,
I think so too.
Yeah, and that we can be critical of Russia and China. I don't think Russia is certainly not a socialist society in the sense it was in the Soviet years by any means,
Right.
And, but when it comes to a confrontation between them and the U.S. imperialists, I think it's very clear what stand needs to be taken, and that's why I'm so enthusiastic. We hosted Jyoti Brar at our conference in Washington, D.C. She flew in and she read a statement, and now the Center for Political Innovation, along with the Party of Communist USA, we've signed the World Anti-Imperialist Platform. We consider ourselves to be affiliates. We signed the Paris Declaration. So it's interesting because, there's no membership in the World Anti-Imperialist Platform. And it's interesting because I guess if there were to actually be membership, it would be illegal. Because did you know under the Voris Act, it's illegal to be a member of any international communist organization? It's still on the book.
Oh, is it?
Yeah, you can't be a member of any international communist organization. So,
how do you spell that act? What is it called?
It's the Voris Act. After a member of Congress, it's a Vooris, I think. The Voris Act.
Oh, Voorhees. Okay.
Yeah, the Voris Act. But so that's why.
So I didn't know that was still on the books.
Yeah, it's an obscure law, and it's not generally enforced. There are many different, individuals that are members of communist organizations internationally. It's not generally enforced, but it's an old Cold War piece of legislation that's still intact. And it's pretty.
There was the World War I Espionage Act that's still being used today. Unfortunately, in my opinion, it was unconstitutional on the day it was written because it's criminalizing free speech. There was a whole lot of that during the McCarthy years.
Absolutely.
Anyway, I recommend that everybody read this book if you're at all interested in socialism or communism or anti-imperialism. I really enjoyed it.
Good.
And
thank you. Yeah, well, I thank you for your time. It was really great of you to take time. I know you're a busy man. It's Labor Day weekend. I know you probably have obligations to your family, but thank you for taking the time. I hope it's good weather out there in Kentucky.
It's hot, but
it's hot here too in New York. It feels like the height of summer, and it's already September. But there you go. Well, thank you, Geoff, for your time once again, and we'll be in touch. And I wish you the best. Thank you.
Thank you. You too.